Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Joydeep Shodangi, Faculty, Department of English, Jogesh Chandra Chaudhary College, University of Calcutta, Kolkata. Friends, we are into Module 28 by Thomas Nashe, The Unfortunate Traveler. This module is prepared by Dr. Shutanuka Ghosh Roy, who teaches English at Tarakeshwar Degree College, Hooghly, West Bengal. Friends, in this particular module, we are going to look at how Thomas Nashe is important in the history of English literature and how far The Unfortunate Traveler is an important text that made effective contribution to the growth and development of English literature during its age. We are to look into the text from different angles. We are also to assess from the implications in relation with social commitment, political purpose, and the critical ideology of the time. Friends, to start with, the term picaresque derives from the Spanish word picaro, a rogue, usually autobiographical chronicle of a rascal's travels. It is an adventure as where one makes his way through the world more by wits than industry. And the most important feature of a picaresque novel is episodic, loose structure, highly realistic, detailed descriptions, uninhibited expressions, and as it gives a panorama of society, at times it's a satire on social classes and stratifications. Friends, if we go for a general introduction to the text and to Thomas Nashe, Thomas Nashe, a contemporary of Shakespeare, wrote during the zenith of the English Renaissance. He is a minor and sometimes called as a minor writer, but his importance and implications are numerous. But his achievements exceed in contemporary reputation as a great polemicist. In today's world, we remember him as the English Juvenal who carried the deadly stock-toe in his pen. He donned many hats: a moralist, a poet, storyteller, social critic, scholar, preacher, jester, pamphleteer, above all, an entertainer. A conscious artist, his stories are told for pleasure in telling, his jokes are cracked for fun, and his whole style speaks of a relish for living. Friends, in the year 1554, La Vida di Lazarillo di Tormes, the life of Lazarillo of Tormes, doubtfully attributed to Hurtado de Mendoza, in which we know the boy Lazarillo describes his services under 7 successive lay and clerical masters, was published in Spain. This novella is credited with founding the genre. It was translated into different languages, including English. The Unfortunate Traveler as a text was published in the year 1594. It is generally considered the earliest example of picaresque novel in England. It is written in the first-person narrative and in pseudo-autobiographical in mode. The episodic narrative of the characters seem typical of the genre of picaresque novel, which comes from the Spanish word picaro, or the literature of the rogue, which was gaining popularity in the just books and pamphlets in the early modern Europe. Hence, both these texts are regarded as the precursors of picaresque mode of fiction. Now, friends, we must understand the historical background of it. In order to understand the historical context that led to the development of these paradigmatic picaresque novels in the 16th and 17th centuries, is essential to take into consideration the circumstances that led to the development of this kind of novel. The critical debate regarding the specifics of this genre continues. However, it is commonly accepted that the picaresque narrative originated in Spain in the 1550s. Picaresque are first-person narratives of a roguish hero, usually of low birth. The picaresque elements which determine the character Lazarillo was present in the first stage of the early Roman literature. Like the Protenius' Stricon had picaresque elements, Lazarillo has similar traits in Petronius' central character Enclopius. The comedies of Plautus were widely read in the Renaissance Europe. If we go in search of the roots of the picaresque tradition, we find even in Arabic literature the literary genre called Makamet, in which a vagabond lives on his wits and presents his tale. The tales of Chaucer and Boccaccio are replete with picaresque elements. However, the modern picaresque thing begins with a seminal work called Lazarillo. Now, friends, what is the storyline of the text? The unfortunate traveler relates the lively adventures of the rogue hero, Jack Wilton, an English page serving in the army of King Henry VIII. He drifts from one place to another, comes across various people, worthy and unworthy, and witnesses many kinds of society. He rambles along, relating to everyday details of his experiences in autobiographical vein. While the English troops were encamped near Tarwin in France, Jack pretends that he has overheard the king and his council planning to away with a certain cider merchant. He terrifies the alley housekeeper, the lord of the misrule, into disturbing the scenario. It is buzzed in the king's head that you are secret friend to the enemy, and under pretense of getting a license to furnish the camp and cider in the Provence, you have furnished the enemy an empty barrels and letters of discovery and corn innumerable. Page 259. He accepts the ring and the heritage of Lord Misrule, completely fooled the Alice housekeeper, and gives away all his supplies to the soldiers and bags for the king's mercy. The profit is turned to the king's advantage. The king enjoys the knavish tricks, whips Jack for his jest, and gives his certain merchant a pension. We have a general feeling that he is addressing an imagined audience of a fellow pages, which makes it rather interesting. In order to understand this perplexing text, we need to refer to the dictionary of sentences and different critical opinions. It is quite evident that Nashe's thoughts are irrelevant and undutiful to the figures of higher authority. We know that in his actual life, Nashe was neither dutiful nor relevant. But our assessment of Nashe's text would broaden the sentiments and would place him in the context of the Elizabethan tradition. The unfortunate traveler relates the lively adventures of the rogue hero Jack Wilton, an English page serving into the army of King Henry VIII. He drifts from one place to another and comes across various people. This gives him a social dimension. Worthy and unworthy, and witness many kinds of society. As possibly by the time you understand why is this text called a document of society. He rambles along relating everyday details of his experience via autobiographical form. Henry VIII is at war against 250 towers of Tourney and Tarwin. That is in line number 254. Jack plays their roles. He is an infant, a maker or chronicler, and a monarch. As an infant, the first jest that he performs is on a figure of some prestige in the army camp. He is the Lord of Misrule. In the cider merchant episode, Jack topples. He tries to steal the limelight as a central figure, instead becomes a marginal one. This episode forms a prelude to Jack's imprisonment in Rome, first on the charge of counterfeiting and second for the charge of murder. Friends, he reduces the beautiful Vidya-mitra, and Jack and Nashe prepares for his later important fall. He falls into the hands of Judach and Dr. Jatchery. Here begin with my purgatory. God plagued me the worse through ill lucks. He narrowly escapes the gallows. He becomes humble and subdued, wit which previously was an instrument of pride is now being replaced as an instrument of observation. He becomes a keen observer of things. He returns to the king, the central figure of this chronicle, who is again at war now in new location. Friends, now we must look into what the critics think about the text. It is quite evident that Nashe's thoughts are irrelevant and undoubtful in this particular context. But if we look into some critical works on this particular text, if we look into the title of the fiction, it immediately associates itself with the Bible. We can refer to God's punishment meted out in the Israelites when they were chased out of their own land and were forced to live in an alien land. Jack accepts the reality and becomes a historiographer of his own misfortunes. It began and ended. The notion of the chronicle, interestingly. Nashe the chronicler is invested with some power, as he is the kingmaker. His alter ego Jack plays three roles in this particular text. He is an infant, a maker or chronicler, and a monarch. As an infant, the first jest as he performs as in the figure of some prestige in the army camp, a lord of misrule. The opening passage puts Jack as a lord, not as a lord of high-minded ruler, but as a lord of misrule. The change of rank shows Jack's slow descent and a retreat in life. There is no advancement. From every beginning, Jack gulls his victims. In the process, he invites his own downfall. Even in the cider merchant episode, Jack truffles. He tries to steal the limelight as a central figure, instead becomes a marginal one. He envisions himself as a monarch, but the higher authority compels him to grovel and lick the dust. His enthusiastic endeavors become an exercise in vain. His tricks are all clothed into boastful defensive euphemisms. His strategies become base and weighs him down. In the episode of massacre of the Anabaptists, it is clearly their pride which is being punished. Like the Titans who tried to overthrow Jupiter, the Anabaptists tried to coerce God. This episode forms the prelude to Jack's imprisonment in Rome, first in the charge of counterfeiting, second in the charge of murder. His descending curve is preeminent in an inevitable descent in the episode where he pretends to be a woman in order to gull a swagger captain who has gone to work on a wench. Quote, I came disguised unto him in the form of a half-crown wench, my gown and attire according to the custom, then to request, page 270. Jack the Nib prepares his own later important fall. He falls into the hands of Judas and Dr. Jacheri. Here begins my purgatory. God placed me, the worst through ill lucks. Now friends, Jack is punished for his carnality. At Julian's hands he suffers both emotionally as well as physically. This is in keeping with his seduction of Vidya-mitra. Even her husband is still alive. His jailhouse seduction is equated with his helplessness of watching Heraclides' rape. He becomes an unwilling spectator of this macabre process. We all are unfortunate travelers. Nashe makes travel as a metaphor of human condition. In this travel, we all make mistakes, suffer, and then the mistakes and ultimately we wait for death. As in this text, we come across different metaphors to travel, to death, and to mistakes. I think in this particular text, we have learned how to travel and our endurance, our perseverance to accept life as it is. To sum up, it is an example of a picaresque type novel. The plot is loosely structured as if randomly composed. It is one of the premier examples of picaresque tradition. Jack Wilton, the protagonist, is a rogue, a knave, a traveling hero, and at the end, we must say there is a moral, a lesson to learn. So friends, with this, the unfortunate traveler, we can really understand the sentiments, the tempo, the moralities of the time. Thank you.
Prose style evokes strong emotions. Witness the academic judgments on Renaissance prose writing by literary scholars in the early 20th century. C.S. Lewis tries hard to find an ideal middle point from which to evaluate the drab and transitional prose of the 16th century, but fails. Nothing in literature is so desperately mortal, he writes, as stylish prose. It's not hard to see why he thinks this. I want to give you my first example of stylish prose. Was Pegasus ever a cow in a cage, or Mercury a mouse in a cheese, or industry a snail in a shell, or dexterity a dog in a doublet, or legerdemain a slow worm, or vivacity a lazybones, or entelechy a slug plum? This is Gabriel Harvey giving his view of Thomas Nashe's prose in his pamphlet Pierce's Supererogation, 1593. I count at least 4 figures of speech. I'm sure that you can find more, actually. Isocolon, asyndeton, homoeutaulton, rhetorical questions, several of them. This sentence may have seemed stylish to Harvey, but even by the 1590s, let alone the 1950s when Lewis was writing, it already felt a little dated and overworked. Lewis is not alone in disliking this kind of prose. In a seminal study of English Renaissance prose writing, Attic prose in the 17th century, Maurice W. Kroll is forthcoming about his preference for the plain style of late Renaissance essayists, Montaigne, Bacon, also the Stoic philosopher Lipsius, and 17th century scientists. Atticism is a style of writing, he claims, that engages the intellect. In contrast, the aureate prose of the 16th century, which he follows Cicero in calling Asiatic, derives from the sophistic oratory condemned by Plato. And I've got a quotation from him, and as I read it, I want you to remember that I like the kind of prose that he is criticising. So he says, its round composition and the even falling of its clauses do not always satisfy the inward ear of the solitary reader. Heard solely by the reflective mind, it is an empty, a frigid, or an artificial style. Yet it is not meant for such a hearing. Rather, it is addressed first like music to the physical ear, and the figures with which its large and open design are decorated have been devised with reference to the attentive powers and the aural susceptibilities of large audiences consisting of people, I hold my hands up, of moderate intelligence and met amid all the usual distractions of public assemblage. Now this has been an influential theory. 1921, the year that Kroll's essay was published, seems a long time ago, but it was republished in 1966 as part of a collection by him on the same theme, Attic and Baroque prose style, and his influence was felt yet 2 decades later. John Stedman, later Deborah Sugar, note in 1984 and 1985 respectively that Maurice Kroll's work on Attic and Baroque prose still dominates theories of early 17th century prose. Sugar went further than anyone else in challenging this. And she makes 2 key points. First of all, she recognises that new descriptive terms were needed for 17th century prose. Ciceronian plain style, Hellenistic grand style, so the opposite of what Kroll is suggesting, and new literary sources to replace Kroll's classical authors, mainly to take account of biblical influence. So that's her first point. Her second point, which she made 3 years later when she published Sacred Rhetoric, is to challenge Kroll's description of the Asiatic and Attic styles as oral and literate. She reminds us, Isocrates was a writer, not an orator. He was concerned with creating a beautiful artistic prose of lasting value, not with arousing the momentary assent of the crowd. Sugar's work has presented the most far-reaching challenge to Kroll's thesis, and I want to return to it at the very end of this paper, to her redefinition of oral versus literate styles. But even Sugar is tied to textual sources to explain stylistic developments. And in contrast, in this paper, I want to think about the influence that performance may have had on the prose style in the 16th century, and in so doing, to trouble Kroll's still as yet unchallenged preference for the inward over the physical ear. Now, I don't disagree with everything that Kroll says. On one thing, he was absolutely right. Renaissance prose is oral in design and often aural in its reception. As Elspeth Jadelska has recently reminded us in study of 18th century prose style, long sentences with loosely connected clauses and an absence of long pauses, full stops, characterise 16th and 17th century prose, signalling its orality. In his orthography, the Elizabethan humanist John Hart not only reforms English spelling, making it phonetic to aid literacy, by which he means reading aloud, but he also explains the punctuation or pointing that he uses to yield the matter much readier to the senses, to both the eye and the ear. So it's just, you have to see this. The first marked, he's got the sign for the comma. The Greeks call comma, for which the Latins and other vulgars have used to strike, thus, slash, or thus, and called ikism, and is in reading the shortest rest near the time of a crotchet in music. There are plenty of other signs too, if we look for them. The schoolmaster Richard Mulcaster uses prose as a verb when talking about the importance of loud reading or vociferation. While in the few books of this period which use the descriptive term prose in their titles, this is from an Ebo search, they are all in genres that we might recognise as performed as well as silently read. Chronicles, discourses, tragical treatises, histories, warnings, psalms with the prose or in prose and metre, godly meditations, prophecies. But, having said this, I do disagree with Kroll's characterisation of writing for the ear as superficially pleasing. And by way of a response, I want to recall the physician Helkiah Crookes, put that in full mark, physician Helkiah Crookes' contrary claim in a chapter on hearing in Microcosmographia 1615, that that listening to a book is better than reading it because we have opportunity to demand a reason of some doubts from him which speaks to us. Kroll imagines a passive audience swayed by a Socrates rhetoric. Crookes' Microcosmographia and his comments on listening, in contrast, are inspired by a different context, the lectures attended by the barber surgeons. The barber surgeons, Crookes notes, have a laudable custom to procure a doctor of physic to read unto them, and they have anatomies, both private for their profiting and public for the honour and reputation of their company, read in their mother tongue. And it's these lectures that Crookes is recalling in his chapter on hearing, when he points to a kind of listening that is inquisitive and interactive. And they also inform the structure of his anatomy, which is organised with controversies. It's the same kind of listening that the literary prose stylist I now want to turn to, Thomas Nashe, wanted to inspire in his readers. Nashe, I will argue, wrote plainly and provocatively for the ear because he thought that auditors, rather than readers, were better judges of prose style. He makes this point in his writings of the mid-90s by dramatising reading aloud in different popular contexts, including, as it so happens, a barber surgeon's shop. This is always meant to prompt us to think about style. And I cannot help but wonder whether our history of prose writing might have started differently if its 20th century proponents had been less skillful and less opinionated silent readers. So, Thomas Nashe is one of the most innovative prose stylists of the late 16th century. Well, I think so. I'm sure we've had a lot of Sydney today. He's also perhaps the closest we come to a prose theorist. His interests are not focused only on prose, of course. His preoccupation with literary style, including poetry, is signalled in his first print publication, the address to the gentlemen students of both universities, which prefaces Robert Greene's Menaphon, and we had that from Stuart. This preface offers an attack on the kind of writing Lewis calls stylish, full of inkhorn terms, and of the idiot art masters, this is Nashe, not me, who encourage this by intruding themselves to our ears as the alchemists of eloquence. And he also reflects on the highs and lows of contemporary writing. One of the lows is the hexameter verse of Master Stanihurst, who singled out with a quotation. I'll do my best to read this. Then did he make heaven's vault to rebound with rounce, robble, hobble, of rough wrath roaring, with thwick, thwack, thurlery bouncing. Nobody has heard such strange language before, Nashe complains, adding, so terrible was his style to all middle ears. However, it is in prose that Nashe chooses to express his views on style. He may not review style after 1589 in quite the same way again, but his views remain largely unchanged. It's just that they are incorporated into his own imaginative prose and given to untrustworthy narrators like the roguish Jack Wilton of The Unfortunate Traveller, or his own compromised persona, Piers Penniless, in the pamphlet and dialogue Have With You to Saffron Walden. But there is one important change for me from 1589. So in 1589, Nashe is certainly concerned with the sound of English writing. We've seen some examples. But in his preface to Menaphon, there are enough references to reading as a visual activity and writing as manual work to allow us to overlook how important orality is to Nashe. So here are just some examples. English Seneca, read by candlelight, he offers, yields many good sentences, as blood is a beggar. Thomas Watson, Roger Ascham and others are commended because they have, quote, set before our eyes a more perfect method of study. While it is daily apparent to our domestical eyes that there is none so forward to publish their imperfections, either in the trade of gloss or translations. But in his prose writing from the mid-1590s, it's the physical ear to which he unfailingly appeals. In making that claim, it's not my intention to ignore the importance of the eye to Nashe's later writings. It's well known that the paratexts of his printed works are integral to the reading experience. You really do need to see his books to appreciate his arguments and his playfulness. And this is because Nashe makes good use of the new media of print. And Neil Rose has given us a very useful list for Have With You to Saffron Walden. I'll just give you mention a couple of things. One thing that Neil notes is that Nashe uses Roman, italic and black letter fonts to distinguish between voices and to signal quotation within quotation. And most dramatically, he also inserts print devices that encourage the reader to join in. So this is one where he invites you to write in your thoughts about the Harveys. And this is a picture of Harvey apparently undoing his breeches ready to let fly upon Ajax. Yet even so, as Rhodes also suggests, everything about Nashe's writings is designed to appeal to the physical ear. It's not just the low speech idiom of characters like John Wilton that suggests this, or those wonderfully colloquial interruptions, here are my parentheses, there did I soft, let me drink before I go any further, in the middle of a sentence. And this one, my principal subject plucks me by the elbow. So it's not just these that draw my attention to that. The text also anticipates its own performance. We are addressed mainly as auditors rather than readers throughout The Unfortunate Traveller. The long opening rambling sentence of The Unfortunate Traveller is probably best heard rather than read, so delayed is its first long pause. And there is an awful lot of the language is also very physical. I've got another example for you. This is the orator Van der Hulk, just one sentence from him. Why should I go gadding and fist-gigging after firking fantando amphibologies? I have no idea what he means. If you were to read this sentence aloud, then you would experience the letters F and G. You'd really feel them. And John Hart explains why. He describes these letters feelingly, touchingly, as among the dumb or dull sounds in our speech that come from the breast with a breath, as it were, groaningly. But more to the point, this work is also designed to appeal to lots of different sorts of ears. And I'd like to turn briefly to Nashe's address to the gentlemen students and the cure he proposes for the surfeit of sweet satiety of eloquence. He says, would gentlemen and riper judgments admit my motion of moderation in a matter of folly, I would persuade them to physic their faculties of seeing and hearing as the Sabaeans do their dull sense with smelling, with a medicine of contraries. The medicine he proposes is the overseeing of that sublime Dickendi genus which walks abroad for waste paper in each serving man's pocket, and the other while perusing of our Gothamist barbarism. Now, I don't think that sentence has ever been, I haven't been able to find in editions a good gloss of that sentence, so Maquero ducks out of glossing it by simply giving us a source for sublime Dickendi genus. But I'd like to make an attempt by proposing that it is Nashe who supplies us with the Gothamist or simpleton's barbarism, the point of contrast, or though he does so, I suggest, by showing us what the sublime Dickendi genus sounds like to Gothamist ears. And this is really where my fascination with Nashe's reflection on prose style begins, not with what he tells us does or doesn't work, but with how he shows us this, either by making us listen to script read aloud or by making us imagine that we are listening to it. In The Unfortunate Traveller, Nashe makes us think about the experience of listening by using a framing device familiar to us from drama, the play within the play, or here the script within the script. The page Wilton, our first-person narrator, travels across Europe in the early 16th century, from the army camps of France to the great houses of Venice in the company of the Earl of Surrey, and along the way he hears the writings of some of the finest humanists of the age, Surrey of course, but also Thomas More and Erasmus. However, the writings I want to pause over are the solemn disputations of Luther, Carol Estadius and others, which Wilton overhears at the University of Wittenberg, and this is what he has to say. A mass of words I wote, well, they heaped up against the Mass and the Pope, but further particulars of their disputations I remember not. I thought verily they would have worried one another with words, they were so earnest and vehement. Luther had the louder voice. Carolus Dadius went beyond him in beating and bouncing with his fists. Why supra nos nihil ad nos, what is above us, is nothing to us. They uttered nothing to make a man laugh. Therefore, I will leave them. Wilton is unimpressed by the actio and pronunciatio of these academic speakers. All he can remember is that Luther's voice was very loud and that Carolus Dadius waved his hands around a lot. And the other speakers fare no better in his estimation. One pecked with his, I know I do this a lot, I'm going to stop now. One pecked with his forefinger at every half syllable he brought forth, and nodded with his nose like an old singing man teaching a young chorister to keep time. Another gasped for wind and groaned in his pronunciation as if he were hard-bound with some bad argument. They're all gross plodders, Wilton concludes witheringly, that had some learning and reading, but no wit to make use of it. These comments reveal Wilton as a Gothamist. It's hard to imagine a more buffoonish response to academic disputations, that the speakers told no jokes. And I'm going to just step back for a moment. There are lots of examples in the period of people who would disagree with the Wiltons. There's some fantastic quotations, which I haven't got time to give you, where people are really sort of pausing and thinking about orality, this kind of oral culture of listening, as for the lower sort. But not everybody agreed. Actio and pronunciatio did matter as part of academic performance. During a visit to the University of Cambridge in 1564, Elizabeth I was disappointed by one disputation. I did want to show you this. Matthew Stokes reports that because the voices of the physicians were small and not audible, Her Majesty first said unto them, Loquimini altia, speak more loudly, and when that would not help, she left her seat, came over to the stage. That made no difference, and so she pays them no attention. That's the kind of performance that Nashe is sending up in The Unfortunate Traveller. To be sure, Wilton's response is buffoonish, but by the same token, his astute aside that they had some learning, but not the wit to use it, is important. Now, I'm especially interested in general in the way in which Nashe uses this framing device of listening to encourage us to think critically about or judge contemporary humanist writing. Of course, Nashe is not the first or only tutor to use this frame to make us stand back and think about language. William Baldwin uses it, Martin Marprelate, that's another important influence on Nashe at this time. And thinking ahead, we've got Shakespeare influenced by Nashe and also Thomas Dekker. But Nashe is the first to use the frame to share his views on the prose and poetry of his day, and not just in Unfortunate Traveller either. The work in which he uses it to greatest effect is, of course, Have With You to Saffron Walden. I'm just going to give you one example in a minute. This pamphlet is Nashe's final riposte to the Harvey quarrel. We all know the quarrel. I won't rehearse that here. I'm not going to go into that in any detail. What I am interested in, though, is the way in which Nashe blames the Harveys' bad prose style, as he sees it, first on its mode of composition, the habit of collecting, we've heard a bit about that, but then on the scene of its reading. This pamphlet is full of scenes of reading, and I won't read them through, but there are lots of moments. They're all oral and oral. There are moments when all of these characters, all of these historical figures are shown reading aloud their work, usually to barber surgeons or in the barber shop. But most telling, though, is the scene of composition. So I haven't got time to dwell over that because I'm aware that we're rushing to the end. But most telling is the scene of composition for Harvey's Pierce's supererogation, John Wolfe's printer's shop. Like the barber shop and the printer's shop are places where texts were read aloud. But when he's writing Pierce's supererogation, Nashe tells us, he's trapped in the printer's shop on his own with no audience because the plague is raging outside. That's really significant for Nashe. In contrast, Nashe depicts a different scene of reading that he suggests shaped the composition of his work. This is a disputation, although with Nashe as the respondent in the guise of Pierce Penniless. Disputation is giving a setting. Blackfriars involves a cast of characters who listen to Nashe reading out excerpts of Pierce's supererogation, and then they comment on it. Oops. So just read very quickly. All of the bits in italics are Harvey's text. Renowned and amicable readers from whom it is not concealed that silence is a slave in a chain, and the pen the hot shot of the musket. Bentivoglia. Mark, mark, a sentence, a sentence. And then the next speaker, that when the caitiff planet reigned a punicle war, and so he goes on, there's 2 sentences, keep tally. And then we have the bit that I read out at the beginning, tell me, I pray you, was ever Pegasus a cow in a cage? And another response, I marry, now it works. I belie him not a word, just as it is there, in his own text, it comes together. Ha ha ha, a good old laugh. Now I am at my conclusion. I started this paper with a quick rehearsal of Maurice Kroll's views on 16th century prose. Elaborately patterned prose like this, he suggests, is addressed first, like music, to the physical ear, and it's superficial, he's really saying. I then turned to Deborah Sugar's challenge to Kroll, noting first her insistence on the limitations of this binary division, Asiatic versus Attic, and second her claim that the descriptive terms oral and literate are misplaced. Yet a close engagement with Nashe's reflection on style in his literary writings complicates this even further. Harvey's prose is literate and academic, and it is shared in contexts that are oral and aural as well as literate. But this, Nashe suggests, should have given him more pause for thought. I don't need to labour the joke of this very shifty pamphlet. It's not just that Harvey does not understand street talk and so uses words unwisely, as Nashe repeatedly suggests. The dramatic situation of reading aloud also reveals the interlocutors struggling to get their mouths around some of Harvey's phrases. Reading aloud reveals Harvey for what it is, contorted and opaque. At the same time, the frame gives Nashe the opportunity to explore and represent a different useful reading style and a different style of popular writing as well, and it justifies it. It takes account of interactive auditors. But what strikes me most about the scene of reading depicted by Nashe, which he calls a disputation, is that, as Crook was to suggest in 1615, hearing is better because, quote, we have opportunity to demand a reason of some doubts from him which speaks to us. And in this pamphlet, the act of reading aloud and discussing the scripted word sustains a critical writing community. Nashe, the respondent, cannot make judgments without interacting with these fellows, and he's placed really at that centre of this witty and chatty community. Thank you.